The dog that never left his owner's grave. A true story. Part 1. The final goodbye. There are few things in this world as pure as a dog's love. It is unconditional, unwavering, and everlasting. Unlike humans, dogs do not understand the concept of time, loss, or final goodbyes. All they know is loyalty, the kind of loyalty that does not fade, even in death. This is the story of a dog who refused to leave his owner's grave. A story of devotion, heartbreak, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his best friend. It all began in a small, quiet town where a man named Michael Carter had lived his entire life. And by his side, from the moment they met, was his beloved dog, Max, a bond that could not be broken. Michael was not a wealthy man, nor was he famous, but he was well known in his town for one simple reason. He was never seen without his dog, Max. Max was a golden retriever, with deep brown eyes that reflected nothing but love and trust. The two had been inseparable since the day Michael had adopted him from the local shelter. Michael had been going through a difficult time in his life back then. After losing his wife to illness and retiring from his job, he had felt completely alone. The house he had once shared with his wife was now quiet, filled only with memories and echoes of the past. That was until he met Max. The moment Michael saw the young retriever at the shelter, wagging his tail and pressing his nose against the bars of the kennel, something inside him shifted. He had come to the shelter with no intention of adopting, but when Max licked his hand through the bars, as if to say, "I choose you," Michael knew he could not leave without him. From that day forward, they were more than just a man and his dog. They were each other's family, the daily routine of love. For 10 years, Michael and Max lived a simple but happy life together. Every morning, Michael would wake up early to make breakfast, always setting aside a small plate of scrambled eggs for Max. They would then take their morning walk, following the same familiar path through the park, stopping at their favorite bench by the lake. In the evenings, Michael would sit on his porch with a cup of tea, while Max rested his head on his feet, watching the sunset with him. To anyone who knew them, it was clear that Max was not just a pet. He was Michael's heart and soul. But as the years passed, time began to take its toll. Michael grew weaker, his steps slower. His once steady hands trembled slightly when he stroked Max's fur. And then, one day, Michael did not wake up. The day everything changed. It was a cold autumn morning when the neighbors noticed something unusual. Max was sitting alone on the front porch, his tail still, his eyes fixed on the front door as if waiting for it to open. But it never did. Inside, Michael had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The town mourned his loss. He had no children, no close relatives, but he had Max. And Max did not understand why Michael wasn't waking up. He nudged his owner's motionless hand, whimpering softly. He barked, expecting him to stir, but nothing happened. And then, the men in black suits came. They took Michael away, placing him in a long wooden box. Max tried to follow, but they gently held him back. The next time Max saw his owner, it was at the cemetery, the funeral that broke a dog's heart. The entire town gathered to say their final goodbyes to Michael. Max sat beside the coffin, ears drooping, eyes filled with confusion. He watched as they lowered the wooden box into the earth. He listened as the priest spoke words of farewell. He flinched when the first shovel of dirt was placed over the grave. And when it was over, everyone left. But Max did not. The cemetery caretaker tried to lead him away, but Max planted his paws firmly on the ground, refusing to move. He lay down beside the fresh mound of earth, placing his head on it as if it were still Michael's lap. And as the sun set, Max stayed there, alone, waiting. A night of mourning. That night, the town expected Max to return home, but he never did. Instead, he remained at Michael's grave, his body curled up against the headstone. The cemetery caretaker found him the next morning, shivering in the cold. He tried to coax Max back home, offering food, a warm blanket, but Max refused to leave. The caretaker sighed, finally understanding, so he let him stay. Every morning, townspeople would pass by the cemetery and see Max still lying beside Michael's grave. Some tried to take him in, but he would always find his way back. It became his new routine. At dawn, He would wake up at the grave, waiting. During the day, he would wander around town, accepting food from kind strangers. By sunset, he would return to Michael's grave and sleep there until morning. And no matter how many days passed, he never stopped waiting. Part 2. The town that watched over him. Max had lost his best friend, but his heart refused to believe it. Days turned into weeks, and yet his routine never changed. He would wake up by Michael's grave each morning, stretch his legs, and wander around town looking for food. But no matter where he went, he always returned before sunset, curling up beside the headstone as if waiting for his owner to come back. People in town soon realized that Max was not just another stray dog. He was a grieving soul. And so, instead of trying to take him away from the grave, they chose to watch over him. A town's compassion. At first, the cemetery caretaker was worried. He had seen dogs mourn for their owners before, but never like this. Never so determined, so unwavering. One evening, as he walked past the graves, he saw Max lying motionless beside Michael's headstone, his golden fur damp from the cold autumn drizzle. With a heavy heart, the caretaker placed an old woolen blanket beside Max and left a small dish of food. The next morning, the blanket was still there, but the food was untouched. Word spread through town. A local baker began leaving warm bread and scraps of meat outside the cemetery gate. A young boy from the neighborhood would visit in the afternoons, sitting quietly beside Max reading a book, as if to keep him company. A retired nurse, who had lost her husband years ago, brought a small water bowl and made sure it was always filled. And so, Max was never alone. He had lost his owner, but he had gained an entire town that cared for him. The changing seasons. Winter arrived, bringing with it harsh winds and thick blankets of snow. Many people worried that Max would not survive the freezing nights. But no matter how cold it got, he never left the cemetery. The caretaker built a small wooden shelter next to the grave, hoping Max would use it, but he never did. He always chose to sleep directly beside the headstone, refusing to put any distance between himself and Michael. On the coldest nights, some townspeople would visit the cemetery, gently brushing the snow off Max's back, making sure he was still breathing. Some even sat beside him for a few minutes, whispering words of comfort, though they knew he could never understand them. Still, he stayed. The cemetery, once a place of silence and sorrow, now became a place of love and kindness. Max's devotion was no longer just his own. It had become something that touched the hearts of everyone around him. The reporter who told the world. One afternoon, nearly 4 months after Michael's passing, a journalist passing through town heard about Max's story. Intrigued, he visited the cemetery and watched as the golden retriever lay beside the grave, his head resting on the stone, eyes distant, waiting. It was a sight unlike anything he had ever seen. He took photos and spoke to the townspeople, gathering every detail of Max's story. Then, he wrote an article titled, "The Dog Who Refused to Leave." Within weeks, the story spread across newspapers and social media. People from all over began sending messages, offering to adopt Max, but the town refused. "He doesn't need a new home," the caretaker said in an interview. "He already has one, right here." And so, Max stayed. Visitors from afar. As the months passed, strangers began visiting the cemetery, wanting to see Max with their own eyes. Some brought flowers, placing them beside Michael's grave as a sign of respect. Others left treats and toys, though Max rarely touched them. A few even sat in silence, tears in their eyes, moved by the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. Some people stayed for minutes, others for hours. But Max? He stayed for a lifetime. An unexpected reunion. One day, a car pulled up near the cemetery gates, and an elderly woman stepped out. She was frail, her movements slow, but her eyes were warm as she approached the caretaker. "My name is Margaret Carter," she said softly. "Michael was my brother." She had been living in another state and had lost touch with Michael years ago. She had only learned of his passing after reading about Max in the newspaper. With tears in her eyes, she knelt beside Max, stroking his fur gently. "He must have loved you very much," she whispered. Max looked at her, sniffed her hand, and for the first time in months, his tail wagged, just slightly. She knew then that her brother's love still lived on in this dog. Part 3. A Town United by Love. Max's story had already touched the hearts of an entire town, but as time passed, it became something much bigger. He was no longer just a dog mourning his owner. He was a symbol of devotion, love, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their canine companions. People who had never met Michael before now felt as if they knew him, through Max's unwavering loyalty. But beyond that, something remarkable began to happen. Because of Max, people began to remember, to grieve, and to heal together. The grave that became a memorial. Before Michael passed, the cemetery had always been a quiet place, visited only by those with family buried there. But now, because of Max, people came for something more. At first, it was just a few visitors, a family who had lost their father years ago, an old woman visiting her late husband's grave, a young girl who had never met her grandfather but wanted to feel close to him. They would walk past Michael's grave, watching Max lie there in silence, and something about his presence made them pause. It made them think about the ones they had lost. And slowly, one by one, people started leaving flowers, candles, and notes, not just for Michael, but for their own loved ones. It was as if Max had reminded them that grief wasn't just about loss. It was about love that never fades. The day the children came, one day, a schoolteacher named Linda decided to bring her class to the cemetery for a special lesson about love and remembrance. She told them Max's story, how he had stayed by his owner's grave through rain, snow, and time itself. The children listened with wide eyes, their hearts filled with a kind of sadness they had never known before. Then, one of them, a boy no older than 8, raised his hand. "Can we write letters to Max's owner?" he asked. The teacher smiled. "That's a wonderful idea." And so, that afternoon, the children wrote letters to Michael, thanking him for loving Max, for showing the world what true loyalty looked like. They placed the letters beside the grave, pressing them down with small rocks so the wind wouldn't carry them away. Max sniffed the papers, then lay beside them, as if guarding their words. It was a moment that none of them would ever forget. The unseen impact of a dog's love. After that day, more and more people visited the cemetery, not just to grieve, but to find comfort. It was no longer just a place of sorrow. It became a place of love, remembrance, and connection. Because of Max, people started sharing their own stories of loss, stories that had been buried inside them for years. Neighbors who had never spoken before now sat together by the graves, talking about their parents, their siblings, their friends who had passed. Strangers comforted each other. Tears were shed, and in the middle of it all, Max remained. The dog who had once been just Michael's companion had now become a companion to everyone who needed him. An unspoken understanding. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, the cemetery caretaker sat on a bench near Michael's grave, watching Max. He thought about how much had changed since the first night he saw the dog curled up beside the headstone. Back then, he had worried. Now, he simply understood. Max was not just waiting. He was watching over something bigger than himself. And for the first time, the caretaker whispered softly, "Maybe we've been looking at this the wrong way. Maybe Max isn't waiting for Michael. Maybe Michael never really left him. Because love like that, it never disappears." Part 4. A farewell that touched the world. Max had already changed the town, transforming the cemetery from a place of sorrow into a place of love, remembrance, and connection. But time waits for no one, not even for the most loyal of hearts. As the years passed, Max grew older. His once vibrant golden fur turned gray around his muzzle. His movements slowed, his legs stiffened, and his breath became heavier with each passing day. Yet, no matter how weak he became, he never stopped returning to Michael's grave. He never stopped waiting. Signs of aging. The first signs of Max's declining health were small. He slept a little longer in the mornings, walked a little slower through town, and sometimes ignored the food left for him at the cemetery gates. The cemetery caretaker noticed it first. He would sit beside Max in the evenings, watching as the dog's breaths grew deeper, his eyes filled with a tiredness that had never been there before. "You're getting old, buddy," the caretaker murmured one evening, gently stroking Max's fur. Max gave a small wag of his tail, but it was weaker than before. The townspeople, who had watched over Max for years, started worrying. The local veterinarian visited the cemetery to check on him, offering medication to ease his pain. A kind woman who had once tried to adopt Max built a soft bed near the grave, hoping he would use it instead of sleeping on the cold ground. But Max never left Michael's side. Even as his body weakened, his spirit remained as strong as ever. A town's last gift to Max. One winter morning, the schoolteacher who had brought her students to see Max had an idea. She gathered the townspeople and said, "Max has given us so much. It's time we give something back." Together, they decided to build something in his honor. Within weeks, a beautiful wooden bench was placed beside Michael's grave, carved with the words, "For Max, a friend, a guardian, a love that never fades." It was not just a bench. It was a place for people to sit and remember their loved ones, just as Max had done for Michael. On the day it was finished, the entire town gathered at the cemetery. They brought flowers, candles, and small tokens of love. Someone read a poem about loyalty. Children placed drawings of Max beside the grave. And Max, though his body was frail, stood proudly beside them, as if he understood that this was his legacy. The final night. That evening, as the crowd left, the caretaker sat beside Max one last time. The old dog rested his head on the man's lap, his breath slow but peaceful. The caretaker whispered, "You've done more than enough. Old boy, you can rest now." For a long time, they sat in silence, watching the sunset, and then, as the last light faded, Max closed his eyes for the final time. He had waited long enough. A goodbye that was not goodbye. The next morning, the town awoke to the news of Max's passing. It was as if they had lost a piece of themselves. People who had never met Michael cried for his dog. Children left small notes beside the grave, thanking Max for showing them the meaning of love. A candlelight vigil was held that night, and for the first time in years, the cemetery was completely silent, not because of grief, but because everyone felt something deeper than sadness. They felt grateful, because Max had not just waited for Michael. He had taught an entire town that love never truly leaves. Part 5. A legacy that lives on. Max was gone, but his story was far from over. For years, he had remained by Michael's grave, refusing to leave, waiting for something the world could not understand. And now, even in his absence, his presence could still be felt. His final resting place was beside Michael, exactly where he had always wanted to be. But what no one expected was that Max's story would live on far beyond the small town where he had once walked. A town that would never forget. The morning after Max passed, people returned to the cemetery, standing silently by his grave. It was no longer just a grave for Michael. Now, it was a place of remembrance for them all. People who had lost loved ones began visiting more frequently, not just to grieve, but to sit by the bench built in Max's honor, to reflect, to share stories, and to find comfort in the quiet presence of the place he had made sacred. The cemetery caretaker made sure Max's resting place was always clean, his grave marked with a small plaque that read, "Max, a friend, a guardian, a love that never fades." And even after weeks and months passed, fresh flowers continued to appear beside his grave. Max had waited for Michael, but now, it seemed, an entire town was waiting for Max, the story that traveled the world. A few months after Max's passing, the journalist who had first written about him published an extended article. The piece was shared across newspapers, websites, and social media, touching the hearts of millions. Readers from around the world commented, "I lost my dog last year. This story reminds me of him. Dogs love us more deeply than we will ever understand." Max waited for his owner, but I think, in a way, his owner was always with him. The story was translated into multiple languages. Documentary filmmakers reached out to the town, hoping to capture the incredible bond between Michael and Max. And before long, people began traveling from all over to visit Max's grave, to sit on his bench, to leave flowers, and to whisper words of love. Max's story was no longer just a small-town legend. It had become a universal symbol of loyalty and devotion. A lesson in love. One afternoon, the schoolteacher who had once brought her students to visit Max sat on the bench with her class. The children were older now, but they still remembered the day they had written letters to Michael. The day they had watched Max lie beside his grave with an unbreakable faith. A student raised her hand and asked, "Do you think Max ever knew that his owner wasn't coming back?" The teacher smiled sadly. "I don't think it mattered to him," she said, because for Max, love wasn't about where Michael was. It was about where he felt closest to him, and that place was here. The children nodded, understanding something deeper than words could explain. Max had not stayed by the grave because he was lost. He had stayed because his heart had already found its home. A new beginning. One day, a stranger arrived at the cemetery. She was an older woman, carrying a small, trembling puppy in her arms. She had read Max's story, and it had reminded her of her own dog, who had passed away years ago. She stood by Max's grave for a long time, then gently placed the puppy down beside the bench. The little dog sniffed the air, its tail wagging slightly, as if sensing something familiar in the earth beneath its paws. The caretaker watched from a distance, understanding what was happening. The woman had come to leave something behind, not to replace Max, but to continue what he had started. The puppy curled up beside the grave, resting in the exact spot where Max had once slept. And in that moment, it was as if love had found a way to return, a love that never ends. Max had waited. He had waited through the seasons, through the years, through the pain of loss and the silence of time. And in doing so, he had taught an entire town the meaning of loyalty, of love, and of remembrance. Even though he was gone, his presence remained, woven into the lives of everyone he had touched. Because true love, whether between a man and his dog, or between those left behind, never truly fades. It lingers in the quiet places. It stays in the hearts that refuse to forget. And sometimes, just sometimes, it finds a way to come back. The end, but never truly goodbye. Max's story was over, but his love? That would last forever. Loyalty like this is rare, but it reminds us of the true depth of a dog's love. Max's story is not just about grief. It is about the power of love that never truly leaves us. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more incredible tales of devotion and companionship. Do you have a story of a dog's loyalty that you would like to share? Tell us in the comments below.